Hello and welcome to part 1 of the shaker table project in the free online woodworking school. In this episode, we're primarily going to be focused on layout, which is both going to include layout of all of the joinery, and also kind of orienting and figuring out the grain of this beautiful walnut we're working with here to give us the most sort of visually pleasing finished result. So minus the plywood for the top and the drawer base, this is pretty much everything you're going to need for the project. We got 4 legs here. In this case, they're all made of solid walnut. We've got a mixture of through sawn / quarter sawn. There's not really any way to distinguish those two cuts when you're working with square sections, but effectively what we mean by that is the grain is at 90 degrees to the faces. And the result of that is that on one face you get really nice quarter sawn figure. On the other face you end up getting more of a flat through sawn finish. And that can sometimes dictate the orientation of these depending on what sort of final look you want. However, we do also have one here which is a rift sawn one, which is where the grain is at 45 degrees to both the faces, and thus you end up with a more linear grain on all 4 faces. This is generally a more preferable look for legs because it gives you a consistent grain pattern on all the faces. You just got to be a bit more selective about the material you cut them from, and I wasn't in this case, but we'll make it work, it's fine. So, 4 legs. We've also got 3 stretchers and 1 drawer front. Again, these are all made of solid walnut, and I've actually cut 3 of these sections all from one length. So if we orient these in a certain direction, we're going to end up with a nice kind of grain wrap around the edge of the table. And then this 4th one here will be for the back panel that won't necessarily be seen. And so that continuous grain wrap isn't really necessary for this one, but if you've got a length long enough, why not? Now, of course, with this grain wrap, there will be legs in each corner, so it's not going to be a seamless kind of join in each of these stretchers, but if you look at it from a perspective of color match, and also on some of these we've got sapwood on one of the edges, it's just going to help the overall piece look nice and consistent and uniform and everything. Next, we've got these sort of little stick kind of bits. These are going to both make up the front rails, one of which is a dovetailed rail, the other one is a small stub mortise and tenon, and these will be above and below the drawer front. And then they're also going to be used for the internal drawer runners on this table, and so we'll probably be selective and choose the ones with visual defects and inconsistencies to be used for those hidden components. Of course, you don't even need to use walnut for it. You could just use something cheap like poplar if you really wanted. Next, we got the drawer sides. This is a lovely bit of curly maple that I didn't know I had. I just dug it out and thought, that'll do. So we got a bit of sizing to do on that. And then we've got the lipping for the veneered top. So this will wrap around the edge of the plywood to give it a solid, durable edge, and also protect the edge of the veneer from peeling up should it come into contact with anything. So, with all that in mind, first we need to figure out the orientation of these components, what we want to face the user as they look at the table, so that we can get the most aesthetically pleasing result, I think is the terminology for it. So first I'm going to have a look at these legs, because not only do we have the grain to contend with, but we've also got a few defects in places. We've got a small knot there. There's a little bit of tear out on here. There's certain ways we can orient these legs so that these defects naturally get removed when it comes to planing the tapers into them. And so that's going to be on the inside faces. The first thing I'm noticing is that this is a super dark leg. Like, it doesn't really match the rest of them whatsoever, both in terms of color and also the grain. It's just so variable. So this is almost certainly going to be a back leg. And so now with these 3, I'm going to see if we've got any that are sort of rift sawn. So that one definitely isn't. Neither is that one kind of. This one isn't, but it's got a kind of linear grain pattern on that face, even though it is mostly flat sawn. It's because the grain goes off in a weird direction like that. So that one's got potential, but then it does have this defect in it. That is a definite front leg. I really like that one. So let's see. Color's quite good. This is already proving quite difficult. No, I think that's a back leg. This one just matches nicely in terms of the colour, the grain, and also just the fact it has got those sort of linear patterns on the perpendicular faces. I think that's really going to help with the look. The only thing we've got to contend with on this front leg is that knot. So the tapers are going to be on the inside 2 faces of these legs. And so as long as this knot is on an inside corner, I think we should be able to just about get rid of that. If it was further up this leg, there would be a chance that we could hide it within the mortise and tenon joint that's going to be happening at the top, but it is pretty far down. There's no chance of that happening. So I think that's going to be the front left leg, that's going to be the front right, and so you are looking at it like that. front left, front right, and the knot is on this inside corner down here. So then we'll quickly do the same for the back legs. There is no chance I'm going to have this dark timber showing, so that is going to be against the wall. So that definitely makes this an inside face. We've also got a bit of a defect here, which I reckon I could remove with a taper, and that leaves quite a nice bit of grain there and there. So that is looking like it is going to be the back left. And then this one, tear out down the bottom, so we definitely need to remove that with a taper. And then we've also got a tiny chip missing there, so that could also be removed with a taper. Does that work? So okay, so back left, back right, and then front left, front right. So we'll just put them together in what their final orientation will be. And then the advantage of this, you can just sort of stand them up and you can check to see your grain match on all the faces. So this is the back. Look at that. It's just, yeah, absolute rubbish that. So this will be the left face. This will be the front face. That looks quite nice. A little bit cloudy up there from very small tear out, but we can get rid of that. And then this will be the right hand face. So we like the look of that. Let's get it in the vise. So all we're going to do on the top of these legs is just do a triangle, and we can very easily get them back in that orientation once they all get separated. And then on these outside faces, we're also going to do a face side and a face edge mark, so that we know these are the two front faces, these are the two edges. Flip it round, and these are the two back faces and the back edges. Okay, so that is the legs done. Now, if we get them all muddled up, we can very easily just look at that triangle on the top. I say easily, it is a little bit confusing. That, and that. And then we've got everything back together, face sides and edges on the outside. That is as far as we need to go with them for now. We've got a little bit of labeling to do still, but in order to do that, we're going to need to lay out these stretchers next. So like I said, I've got 3 bits here that came out of one length. So we've got a really nice bit of continuous grain there. And yeah, I don't think this one, did I cut this from the same thing? No, it doesn't look like it. So these are all from one length. It doesn't make sense to make this the back rail because that is going to be against the wall. You're never going to see it. So it actually makes sense to make it the drawer front. And so we'll just label that as a drawer front for now. And we can put that aside until later in the project because we're not going to be doing the drawer just yet. We just need to get these two. So this will be the left rail, this will be the front rail. I know this is kind of in reverse, and then this will be the back rail. So the back rail will technically go sort of round here somewhere, because then it will be like that, and then that, and then the drawer front will be here. So we're going to need to label each of these corners and then the corresponding leg, so that when we cut the joinery, we know exactly what goes in where. So let's get these laid out. How did that go? Like that. So with the back panel in the middle, we might as well make it so the nice grain's on the outside. And we'll just double check with that drawer front again. So that is continuous grain there, and it would match on the other side to here. Yep, that's correct. So that is the orientation we're going for. On each of these, we're going to go A, B, C, D, E, and F. I've done them a little bit back from the edge because we're going to be cutting tenons and stuff on these, so there's no point cutting into the marking. And then we'll make this a face side, so that indicates this is the outside face, and then the face edge is going to be on top because that is going to be flush with the top of the legs. And then we will go back to the leg pile, and we're going to translate this A, B, C, D, E, F onto the edges of the legs so that we know what joint goes where. So we know this is the front face, so let's flip it this way. This is where A and B are going to be joining. So on the side of these legs, A, B, and that shows that B is going in there, A is going in there like that. So we can put that aside, flip it round. We're now looking at the back. You can see that horrible dark leg. Next we get C and D. C and D, pop that aside. And then one more rotation. This is going to be E and F. Okay, so that's nice and easy. Now when it comes to cutting the joinery, we know that we've got A and B there. And when we cut the mortise and tenons, it's very obvious that it's going to go like that. We can also confirm that the face side and the face edge are on the outside faces, and the face side and the face edge on the stretcher is on the outside and the top. So that gives us the legs and the rails, at least on the sides and the back. The only other thing we've got is the dovetailed rail and the mortise and tenon rail above and below the drawer front. And we might as well do this now because the grain selection still sort of comes into this. And I've got all of these little sticks here that have varying grain on the faces and the edges, and you know, we can be selective about it. Why not take the opportunity and do it now? So what I'm looking for here is, again, sort of quite linear grain on these narrow edges. And so honestly, this first one looks pretty good anyway. So I think we'll go for that. This one looks quite flat sawn. We'll put that aside. This one, again, there's not much going on with that. This one is interesting, but it has got a big bit of tear out here. Then again, the other side looks pretty good. So we could just make this an inside face. That one's got potential. This one, again, it's quite dark. I don't like the look of that. That one flat sawn, and yeah. So that leaves us with these two. Quite a nice color match going on. We'll just make sure to have this defect on the inside face so you'll never see it. So again, if we bring our two front legs back, thinking about it, we can probably just cut off that defect altogether because these are so oversized. Right, they're going to be about as long as this stretcher. So they'll be around about that. So let's see, yeah, that grain there's pretty nice. Is that sort of what we want? Annoyingly, I kind of like this bit of the grain with the defect on the back of it. So I think I'm actually going to keep that bit with the defect just so I can include this nice bit of grain here. But I think I'm going to flip it that way. To be fair, this top one doesn't even match the color on the drawer front. Maybe I will need one of those darker ones again. I've just swapped the bottom one already. Okay, so I've actually got one of the side legs there, so that is going to be A, then we need to get F. So these will be our two front faces. Again, we can confirm that by looking at the triangle on the top. So seeing as we finished on F, what we'll do is we'll make this top one G, H, and then we'll do the same on this one, G and H. It's still got to be cut to size, so I might have to relocate those, but we'll cut them to size in a minute. And then just put that in there. So we know it's going to be around about here. So I, J, and J. And again, we'll just do face side and a face edge on these. So we know they're going to be the outside faces. There we go. That is the main carcass all labeled. So we know what our front legs are. We know what our back legs are. We've paid attention to grain direction. So we're going to get the most consistent result. And we've also marked out where the joinery is going to be so that we don't get them all muddled up when it comes to cutting them, fitting them, assembling it. And we don't end up joining a leg to one of the stretchers like this, for example. Perfectly possible, trust me. So take your time with this bit, pay attention to grain direction, pay attention to how you want everything to look. And so with all that said and done, next we're going to focus on marking out the mortise and tenons for the side rails and also the dovetail and the mortise and tenon for the front one, because we actually need to mark them out simultaneously, and I'll show you why. So we're going to be marking out the mortise and tenons with a marking gauge, but before you do so, just get a square and double check using the face edge as a reference, which is going to be the top edge, that the sides of these components are definitely square. And just remember to always reference from this face. Don't be measuring from the bottom here because that can start adding up inconsistencies. So that top one's good. Lovely. So we're going to score around all four faces of both sides of all three components. And you can make these lines pretty deep if you want. And if you're struggling to use a marking gauge correctly, I've done a video that will be appearing in the top corner now that teaches you how to use these effectively, because there is actually a bit of a learning curve to this relatively simple process. Okay, so next we're going to start marking out the tenons. Now you can see that I've got the outside of the components facing me, and this is going to be the face that we reference the marking gauge from at all times. This is why we do face sides and edges, because if you start doing things like this and marking from the opposite side, that's where inconsistencies show up. This is our reference face from now on. So this is 18 millimeters thick. We're going to divide it into three, so 6 millimeter sections. If you're using imperial, it's going to be about 3/4 inch, so divide it into 1/4 inch sections. I'm just going to measure it first and give myself 2 marks on 6 and 12 millimeters. So that'll make it easier for me to line up my mortise gauge. So we'll get that one lined up with one of them, lock it down. Get the second one lined up with the other line. Another neat little trick here is to set the mortise gauge to the width of your chisel. That'll definitely help you later on. And so the advantage of this mortise gauge is this thing. So with these two locked at the distances we need, we can then lock this down, and that's going to lock these two bars the same distance apart while still giving us the opportunity to adjust the stock here, which is going to be really essential later on when it comes to creating the offset between this rail and the leg. I'll show you that in a minute, but for now, we're going to mark these lines out. Now, don't be deceived by these marking gauges. You don't need to mark both lines simultaneously. It's actually quite difficult to do so. Okay, so the cheeks of the tenons are all marked out. One thing I think I'm seeing is there is a slight kind of misalignment with the mortise gauge, meaning that the tenon is slightly biased to the inside edge of these components. Now, that isn't actually a problem. As long as it's consistently offset across all three components, it'll all come out in the wash later on. Issues arise when the offset is from, let's say it's larger from the face side on one end, but it's larger from the inside face on the other end. And so instead of your tenons sort of being offset like this, they're offset like that. That is going to cause a real problem because when it goes into your legs, it's going to do something like this. And so that is why it is absolutely essential to always use the marking gauge from the face edge, because any sort of small misalignment like that, it all gets cancelled out later on. So don't get too pedantic if you see any misalignment like that. It'll all be fine. So next we need to mark out the side profile of the tenon, including the haunch and the actual tenon itself. I prefer to do this with a marking knife, and then we'll sort of mark the waist area with a white pencil. And so we are going to start from the top. So the plans are telling me the haunch sticks out 6mm from the shoulder line. So I'll just give myself a little mark on one of the components. And then I can actually just set up a marking gauge to that distance and mark it across all of them. This is not the same marking gauge I'm using for the mortises. That one needs to stay set as it is because we'll need that later. I can do whatever I want with this one. Okay, so that is going to get marked along here. And on the other ones, remember this is the top edge. We don't need to do this on the bottom of these components because there's no haunch there. It's just a 90-degree shoulder. Then we'll get those components one by one, flip them onto their faces and mark that haunch down the face here, roughly about that far. We'll square it off in a minute. That face and that face. So both the outside and the inside face of the tenons. So you should be left with something like that. That little square section is the haunch and it just goes round the edges like that. And so next we'll square off a line up here and down the bottom there to indicate the overall height of the tenon. So again, looking at the plans, I can see the overall height of the haunch. So these side of the components are the top edges. That's where we're going to be marking down from. Measure the distance we need to go down and put that on the marking gauge. And we'll square that down from the top. Again, on both sides of both components. Okay, so that is all of them marked out. So we know that we're going to be cutting away this bit. So this is what you should be left with. Goes all the way around the end grain, all the way up the side. You can see the haunch there. That is what we're going for. Okay, so that's the top of the tenon. Now we've got a little shoulder to mark on the bottom. So we'll just reset the marking gauge to that, to whatever that offset needs to be. And again, mark that on the bottom of all of these components. And this can go round the end and also down the other side as well. Okay, so that is the tenons on the side and the back rails figured out. Next, we're going to mark out the mortices on the legs. And this is where it gets quite interesting with the mortice gauge. Okay, so a couple of things to remember here. Firstly, remember not to mark a mortise on the outside of the leg. Part of the beauty of these face sides and face edges is that they leave two blank faces on the inside here. And if they're blank, that means there's a mortise going into there. With exception to the front leg. The front legs have a dovetail and a small mortise and tenon that isn't going to be marked out in the same way as this. And so we need to make sure we don't accidentally mark that out. So what I'll do is I'll use my triangle on the top of the legs to get everything back into the orientation that it should be in. So these are the two front legs. We've got the dovetail and the small mortise and tenon there. And so on these inside faces here, there is not going to be a tenon. Sorry, I mean a mortise. However, on the back faces of them, flipping the full 180 degrees, there is going to be one here. So what I like to do in places like this is just give myself a little scribble like that. That way I know there's going to be a mortise there, so it just ups the chances of me putting it in the right place. The other thing you can do is get one of the rails, get it flush with the top of the leg, and just give yourself a line down the bottom there. And that way, when it comes to marking out the mortise, we don't accidentally scratch below that line and create a marking gauge line that we then need to remove on the exposed face. So the front legs are done. They should be in that orientation. Nothing on the inside faces. Mortise marked out on the back. Let's put those aside. These back legs, we know there's going to be a mortise here, a mortise here, and then also between them, again, mortise mortice, and then just mark the boundaries on them as well. Again, we will just double check everything. So put it all back together. When we open this up, we should see a mortice on the back legs, nothing on the front legs. Turn it sideways and we should see a mortice on both of them. Smashing. Let's get marking them out. So we'll work through these alphabetically just to do it like systematically. So we've got A, B, and B, and we're going to mark out the lines down here to indicate where the mortice is going to go. Now these joints are not going to be flush on the outside. There's actually a small step of about 5mm, which just adds an interesting detail to that face. But of course that means that our mortice gauge is not going to be set for that correct offset. And this is where this interesting locky thing comes in handy. So because we have a 5mm step on the outside, and this original offset was 6mm. The first line on this mortice needs to come in 11mm, 5mm plus the 6 on here. So let's just measure that, give ourselves a little mark. And again, we're just making sure that we're doing that from the face edge. We're not doing it from the inside. So measured in 11mm. While keeping this locked down, we undo the top, I did them up tight. We undo the top two and we slide them in so this first gauge lines up with that 11mm one. And the beauty of this is that these are moving in unison with one another. That distance between them is still 6mm. We're just changing the offset. And again, this does not need to be bang on, because as long as it's marked from the outside face, all gets cancelled out. So don't be as pedantic as I'm being here. So we've got that. Let's mark those up the leg, making sure not to go past this white line that we've marked. It's going to go all the way up to the top. And because this is a front leg, we've only got one mortice on here. This one, there's no scribble there, so we don't need a mortice there. This one, the face edge is on this side, and it's actually a back leg, so we've got this one and this one to do. Okay, face edge. Got another back leg, so we've got two mortices to do on here. And then back round to the front leg. So only one mortice, face side, reference the marking gauge from that. Smash in, there we go. Again, always double check, put the legs back together, start from the front, make sure that you haven't accidentally marked a mortice out there, but you have marked them out on the back, yep. Back legs, mortice there, the offset looks correct from both edges, and then here the mortice is there, and we've got a mirror offset which indicates it's done correctly. Lovely. Right. So next we need to mark the height of the tenon within these lines. Now what have we got? We've got component E here, so we might as well do this with the corresponding component. And this is pretty simple. All you've got to do is translate the lines from the tenon onto the mortice. But what I like to do here is just slightly move the tenon up so it's slightly proud of the top of the leg. Not by much, just enough to kind of catch your fingernail on it. That way, when this is all assembled, all you've got to do is plane down a little bit of this rail in order to make it flush. There's always a slight bit of misalignment when putting together mortice and tenons, and so if you aim to make it flush and then it ends up sinking too far down and you've got the leg to flush down, that's end grain, and it's just over an inch square in this case, and so that's going to be a little bit annoying. Much easier to plane down the top of this, and so we'll just give it a little bit that we can take down after assembly. So then give ourselves a mark there and a mark there. And of course we could do this to every leg. We could create an offset there, but then that little thing that we're feeling there could be larger on some and smaller on others, and so we're just opening ourselves up to more misalignment. What makes more sense is just to set up a marking gauge to that first line and scratch that around the top of all the mortices, and then get it again, reset it to the bottom, we'll just scribble them out, make them nice and clear. So that's the mortice and tenons done, at least for the side legs. Now, this is the opportunity to mark out the front and the front bottom. Well, this is the opportunity to mark out the two front rails using the shoulder lines that we've established on these side rails. Or should I say, the back rail. So we've got A, B, C, D, E, F. That is the back component because I wrote it on the inside. So we can discard of these because these shoulder lines are going to be what dictates the shoulder lines on these front rails. So we've got our back component. Let's get the front rail sort of lined up with it. This kind of area of the grain is what I wanted to use for it. And so then using the shoulder line of the tenon, not using the one of the haunch that's on the outside. Remember to use the shoulder line. Give yourself a little mark. Same again on this one. Now I'll just put them together to confirm that they are definitely the same size. Spot on. Now remember, what we've just marked here are the shoulder lines. That doesn't include the joint on either side of it as well, such as the dovetail or the tenon. So we need to add those before just blindly cutting them to those sizes. So the dovetail I've got listed as being 12 millimeters tall. The tenon I've got listed as being 10 millimeters. So I know that G and H is the dovetail. So we'll do those first. Add 12 millimeters to each of those shoulder lines. And those two marks I can just square across, and I'll cut those down in a second. And the tenon is 10. Okay, and then we'll cut them to size with a saw and shoot them down to their final dimensions. Okay, so now we're left with two slightly different sized components, but the shoulder lines are exactly the same. We just need to scratch them round all four faces now. So to do this, all you got to do is set it to the shoulder line of, let's say, the dovetail to begin with. But before marking it, just double check that it lines up with the other one. Because if you've just done that whole process I just did and you've taken down more material on one side than you have the other, the dovetail on this side could be shorter than that one, for example, and therefore it's going to throw off your marking gauge. And so if you found you've done that, just take another shaving or two off of the taller side to make sure that this is exactly the same on both sides. So we're going to start with the dovetail, all four faces. Again, I'm just going to give myself a mark on the front and then get that back component to confirm that they are exactly the same. So now that thickness needs to be transferred to the top of the front legs before we reset the marking gauge to the mortise below. So we'll use the triangle again to find our front legs, which should be these two. These are the front faces. We can confirm the dovetail is here with G, G, H, and H. So the dovetail is going to be nesting in the top, sort of like that. And so all we've got to do is get this marking gauge and scratch it down the top of the legs from the inside face so that we know how deep to cut that lap dovetail when it comes to doing it later in the project. Okay, and now we can reset the marking gauge to do the tenon. Exactly the same process. Set the gauge up to one of the shoulder lines. Confirm it on the other side. Yeah, it is exactly the same as the dovetail one. So we'll continue that all the way around on both sides. There's our tenon component. Okay, so with both of those shoulder lines marked out, next we're going to focus on the dovetail. And what you might notice about both the dovetail and the tenon is that they're slightly offset. The reason for this is because, again, similar to the side rails, there's a 5mm step on these front rails where they're set back from the front of the legs. The reason for the offset of the dovetail and the tenon is to simply allow that joint to land in the middle of the leg while still accounting for that 5mm offset. So this is the front. This is where the smaller offset's going to be. I'll give myself a little mark there. On there. And I'm doing a 1/6 dovetail on this. Whatever your preference is on dovetail pitches visually, 1/6 tends to be the best for internal joinery like this, just because you get the most mechanical advantage from it. And even if these kind of fragile corners on the short grain were to chip or something, doesn't really matter because it's all internal. Anyway, mark the waist and do the same on the other side. And now finally, the tenon. Now, much of this can just be done with the marking gauge. And honestly, for this, you probably don't even need a mortise gauge. So if you're following the plans, this will be pretty self-explanatory. We've got a 3mm offset from the top and the bottom on both sides. And then find the front. That's where our smaller offset's going to be. And remember to scratch these down the sides as well. Makes it much easier. Then reset the marking gauge to the larger offset for the back. Again, this is such a small tenon, I wouldn't necessarily worry about using the face side for this. It would be good practice, but as long as you're certain this component is square, you'll get away with it in this case. And then just mark all the areas where you're going to be removing, and that is your tenon marked out. Now, much like we've done for these side rails, you could go ahead and mark out the mortises for this little stub tenon as well. but I'd advise holding off on it for the time being because the location of this mortise on this front leg really depends on where the side rails land. It will make a little bit more sense later in the project, as is always the case when I'm trying to explain things like this. I'd advise holding off on marking out that mortise until we've kind of got the rest of it dry assembled, and then we can be really, really precise about the location of this, which is going to give us a much better fitting drawer. And so with that, that's everything pretty much marked out. We've got the tenons done, we've got the mortises done, we've got the dovetails done. All the grain is oriented in the direction that we want. It all color matches nicely for the most part. We've achieved quite a lot in this episode, and it's going to help us tremendously through the rest of the project. Take your time with the marking out. I always say this, it doesn't matter how accurate you are with a saw, a plane, a chisel, whatever. If you're following inaccurate lines, it's all for naught. You need to put a lot of time into this, make sure it's right, and it will pay dividends later in the project. That's all I've got to say for this episode. If you enjoyed it, please don't forget to press the like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you in part 2, where we are going to be, what are we doing? Chopping out the mortises. I'll see you then.